When people think about aging, they often picture a peaceful life, filled with time to relax, enjoy grandchildren, and savor the rewards of years of hard work. But the truth is, not everyone's golden years shine. In fact, some people find themselves living in deep loneliness, regret, or hardship in their later years. Not because life was unfair to them, but because of patterns they followed for decades without realizing where they would lead. I learned this truth when I started volunteering at a senior community center in Springfield, Illinois. My name is Michael Harris, and I had recently retired from my career as a high school counselor. I thought helping out with social programs for older adults would be a way to keep busy and give back. I didn't expect that it would open my eyes to the many ways people can unknowingly set themselves up for a miserable old age. The first day I arrived, I met Edna, a gentle woman in her late 70s who was always dressed neatly, but with a sadness in her eyes you couldn't miss. She told me she had spent her entire life keeping to herself, avoiding friendships because she didn't want to get hurt. Now, she realized that her world was so small, there was no one to call when she felt lonely. She wasn't poor in money, but she was poor in connection, and in the quiet hours, she regretted it deeply. Then there was Charles, who had spent decades being stubbornly independent, refusing help from anyone and pushing people away when they tried to get close. At 82, he found himself needing help with nearly everything, but pride made him refuse it. He was miserable, not just from physical struggles, but from the deep frustration of having no one he could comfortably rely on. Over the months, I met many more residents, and the patterns became clear. There were 9 types of elderly people whose choices, attitudes, or habits led them to lives that were unnecessarily unhappy. Some were lonely, others were bitter, some were financially stressed, and some were trapped in regret. But it was the 8th type, the one I'll tell you about later, that truly shocked me. It wasn't the kind of situation you expect to hear about, and it's one most people never think could happen to them. The first type were those who had neglected their health for too long. Take Howard, for example, a 70-year-old who had spent his youth ignoring medical advice, eating poorly, and avoiding exercise. "I thought I was invincible," he admitted with a weak chuckle. Now, simple tasks left him exhausted, and chronic pain kept him from enjoying hobbies. What made him miserable wasn't just the physical discomfort. It was knowing he could have prevented much of it if he had cared for himself earlier. The second type were the ones who clung to bitterness. Martha, 75, had been divorced for 30 years, but still talked about her ex-husband as if the wound had happened yesterday. She held on to every grudge, every slight, and every resentment. Conversations with her always drifted toward her grievances, and you could see the tension in her face. Bitterness had become her constant companion, and it showed. The third type were those who never learned to manage money wisely. At the center, I met Alan, who had made good money in his working years but lived beyond his means, thinking the income would never stop. Now, in his late 60s, he was dependent on assistance programs and lived in constant stress about paying bills. His misery wasn't just about lacking money, it was about the feeling of having failed himself. The fourth type were those who had made their careers their entire identities. Nancy, 71, had been a respected attorney, but when she retired, she didn't know who she was without her job. She had no hobbies, no social life outside of work, and no sense of purpose. "I wish I'd invested in people, not just cases," she told me. The fifth type were those who isolated themselves after loss. George, a widower, had stopped attending church, stopped seeing friends, and spent most of his days watching television in silence. He told me he felt like life had ended when his wife passed. Without human connection, his spirit had grown dim. The sixth type were those who never adapted to change. Ethel, 80, still refused to use a cell phone or email and avoided anything that felt too modern. It left her cut off from her grandchildren, who lived in another state and communicated mostly online. Her resistance to learning kept her disconnected. The seventh type were those who lived in denial of their age. Clara dressed like she was still 25 and refused to discuss topics like health planning or future care. She avoided making wills or having important conversations, and when health issues hit suddenly, she was unprepared and deeply stressed. And then came the eighth type, the one that haunted me the most. This was the type who, for years, gave everything to others but never took time to nurture their own needs or build their own life. Her name was Patricia, but everyone called her Patty. She was 74, soft-spoken, and the kind of person who always had cookies ready for visitors. Patty had raised 3 children as a single mother, cared for her aging parents, and later devoted herself to her grandchildren. She had spent her life giving, to the point that she had never taken a vacation for herself, never pursued her own dreams, and never saved much for her own future. Now, in her later years, Patty found herself completely alone. Her children lived in different states, busy with their own lives, and rarely visited. Her grandchildren were grown and distant. The parents she had cared for were long gone. All the love and time she had poured out had left her with nothing for herself. One afternoon, she confided in me. I thought if I gave everything, they'd always be there for me. But life doesn't work that way. People move on. I should have built a life for myself, too. Her loneliness was palpable, and it wasn't because she was unloved. Her children cared for her in their own way, but because she had no identity, no plans, no community, and no financial stability beyond a modest social security check. Her giving heart had never been balanced with self-care, and now she lived each day in quiet regret. The ninth type were those who let fear control them. Carl had always been afraid of change, afraid of travel, afraid of trying new things. He had stayed in the same small town his entire life, working a job he didn't love, never taking risks. Now, at 78, he wished he had been braver. I was safe, he said, but I missed out on living. Spending time with these people made me rethink everything about my own retirement and future. I realized that the miserable years many face aren't just about bad luck. They're often the result of years of small choices, attitudes, and habits that slowly shape a person's life. As I helped organize bingo games, cooking classes, and discussion groups, I began gently encouraging the residents to try new things, reconnect with people, and take small steps toward joy, even if it was late in life. Some resisted, but others, like Patty, began to change. She started attending art classes, joined a book club, and even saved up to visit her sister in Florida. It's not too late, she told me with a smile. And that, I think, is the biggest lesson. Even if you find yourself fitting into one of these 9 types, you can start rewriting your story. Because the worst thing about a miserable old age is believing you have no power to change it.